There's excitement everywhere. The circus is here. Everyone is headed for the big top to thrill to and cheer the fun makers, daredevils, freaks, and
As the 1800s drew to a close, circus was at the height of its popularity and financial prosperity. Freak shows were a crowd favorite, drawing crowds from all over the world eager to witness for themselves the strange and curious world of both animal and human freaks. Today, one might recoil at the thought of gathering to gawk at a person with missing limbs or dwarfism, displayed in a way meant to draw attention to and to profit from their physical or mental differences. It's hard not to associate these freak shows of human oddity with the exploitation of people with no other say, victimized by their unscrupulous managers and the people who paid to see them. One may even find themselves grappling with a sense of guilt and discomfort garnered from these strange, sometimes indecent displays. There's often an instant assumption that sideshows were degrading and exploitative, rather than an opportunity for the mentally or physically disabled people to interact with new people and to make an independent living. However, it is important to consider that our reaction to these freak shows is largely about how our time views these otherly abled people, including those with noticeable physical differences. Rather, it can be said that our thought of what a freak show is largely affected by the media we've seen regarding them. In the words of author Robert Bogdan, a quote, "freak is not a quality of a person, but rather a product of our perception and understanding of what we see before us."
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm presenting here for your approval the biggest, the baddest, the plumpest, the sweetest lady. Hey, lay off, will you that, babe? The biggest giant in the world.
Today, many disability activists consider the words midget and giant degrading, while performers of the Victorian age used these as self-descriptive and as titles for their performances. For many of these people, the circus provided a means of income and self-sustainability by providing them income, housing, friends, family, fame, and a way to escape from the mundanity of their old lives. Where before the circus, they may have been confined to a mental institution, but now they could travel the country and have opportunities that they would have otherwise never been afforded. Of course, there were many instances of performers being taken advantage of physically and financially, so it is very important to consider the social and economic factors of why a person joined the circus in the first place. Now, all of this was occurring at a time when sideshows were at the height of its popularity, between the years of about 1840 to around 1940. In the early years of the circus's success, Victorians had a sincere fascination with the odd, strange, and the occult, adorning both their homes and their clothing with examples of animal oddity. Just look at these birdwing hats and human teeth jewelry. Oddity was a common and sought-after part of fashionable life, and they were spurred by stories of mythical creatures and animals being discovered overseas. These were things that were heard about, perhaps even mythological in their understanding, and certainly outside of the realm of their own experience. At the same time, biologists and taxonomists were focused on the classification of these new animals through the practice of teratology. In fact, many of the animals displayed in the first museums were not yet classified at all, and were instead called what-is-its, or nondescripts. The term nondescripts became used to describe animals and people who were so different than what was known by scientists that they did not yet have a name or a diagnosis. This concept became the basis for the sideshow of human oddity. This also meant that scientists and physicians were constantly on the search for unique cadavers for the study of these unknown conditions. All of this leads to the subject of our story. Edouard Beaupré was known as a giant, but little was known about his condition or why certain people grew to such staggering heights. Furthermore, Edouard was uncharacteristically strong for a giant, who were generally weakened by the weight on their joints. Edouard, therefore, was able to make a name as both a giant and a strong man for the Barnum and Bailey Circus from 1901 up until his death in 1904. Edouard's story is one of tragedy and exploitation, but it's also the story of a young man who loved horses, who loved his family so deeply that he was willing to put himself on display to provide for them. It's the story of a bright and timid man with a sense of humor and great dignity, placed into the spotlight for curious eyes and only to slip through the cracks of the legal system after his death. From being displayed in store windows, passed from circus to museum and back to circus, and finally to being abandoned in a shed and discovered by children years later, it's the story of 87 years of painful legal battle to repatriate his body back to Willow Bunch. This is the story of Edouard Beaupré, the giant of Willow Bunch. In the dead of the freezing cold Saskatchewan winter, Edouard Beaupré would become the first child born and baptized in the tiny farming parish of Tel de Sol, now called Willow Bunch, to his mother, Florestine Pichet, a métisse of the Red River, and to Gaspard Beaupré of l'Assomption, Quebec, Canada. At birth, Edouard was reportedly 9 pounds and appeared to be a healthy, normal baby. Reverend Saint Germain, Order of Immaculate Mary, baptized him on the day of his birth at La Brette Church in Willow Bunch. His godparents were Jean-Louis Légaré and Florestine Pichet. By all accounts, he seemed completely normal. His father was 5 feet and 8 inches tall, and his mother Florestine was 5 feet 4 inches tall. My little village in the valley. As a Métis, Edouard was entitled to a land scrip provided by the Canadian government. These scrips were given as a response to the growing tension in the Red River in Manitoba, where his mother Florestine was from. She, along with 67 other Métis families, had fled the area as rebellion was growing, led by Louis Riel. Riel was also a friend of the Pichets and of the Bonneau family, who were the new neighbors of Edouard's family in Willow Bunch. It was Pascal Bonneau who had helped retrieve Riel's body from the United States after his death. Now, remember the Bonneau name, as they played an important role in Edouard's life. Edouard's unusual growth began by the age of 3. At the age of 9, he was already 6 feet tall. At age 12, he was 6 feet and 6 inches, and by 17, he was 7 feet and 1 inch. His youth was spent in Willow Bunch, where he attended school very irregularly. He tended to prefer being outdoors rather than sitting cramped in his desk, which he was of course quickly outgrowing, and so his education remained rudimentary. Although he did speak, or at least had some kind of handle on 4 or more languages, including French, his native language, English, Cree, Sioux, and possibly some dialect of Michif. Michif is an endangered Métis language which combines components of English, French, and Cree. Now, while Edouard would go on to become the tallest man in Canadian history, his family, again, was of average height, and he was the only one of Gaspard and Florestine's children to display any sort of growth abnormality. At the age of 17, he had begun to outgrow his bed, and his father Gaspard began placing a trunk at the foot of his bed to place his feet on. However, he eventually outgrew this as well, and so Gaspard had a special bed ordered for him, which was 9 feet long. His clothes and his shoes also had to be special ordered. As a young teen, Edouard worked as a farmhand on Pascal Bonneau's ranch. While working there, he was able to nurture his love of horses and the outdoors. However, this would also be the site of a life-changing injury. You see, Edouard was beginning to outgrow the horses on the ranch. His feet were dragging on the ground whenever he tried to ride them. At about the age of 17, Edouard was bucked off one of these horses, which then kicked him in the face, shattering his nose and several bones in the side of his face. We can see in his later photos that he's turned to the side, attempting to hide the injury from the camera. There are a few different stories about how Edouard actually received this injury in the first place. One account states that he was just born with it as part of his giantism, but this is easily proven wrong based on photos and medical research from today. Another account states that he was bucked off of a horse, but that this occurred much later when he was already in the circus. Still another account, which is published in this article here on the screen, claims that he gains the deformity by constantly rubbing the side of his face so much that the bones simply moved. Because Edouard had outgrown his horses, he could no longer work on the Bonneau ranch. It was around this time that a family friend named Andre Gaudry had suggested to Edouard that he could potentially make a living in the circus. And as Edouard's family was struggling economically and feeling that there was little other option for him, Edouard agreed to go on a test trip. And so he, Andre Gaudry, and another family friend named Albert Légaré left to tour across Canada and gauge the public's reaction to Edouard. Unsurprisingly, the crowds reacted with intrigue and amazement. And so the 3 men traveled to cities in Canada and in the United States, drawing crowds wherever they went. On one occasion during a train ride, Edouard had caused a commotion by reaching into the overhead luggage without having to stand. While Edouard was traveling, he was commissioned to perform acts like lifting weights and horses, and wrestling with renowned strongmen. In 1901, at the age of 21, he was 7 feet and 9 inches tall. Unfortunately, also by 1901, Edouard had contracted tuberculosis, which was the leading cause of death in America at the time. On several occasions, he would go back to visit his family in Willow Bunch, and realizing that he was sick, his family would beg him to stay, but Edouard believed that he was the only one that could provide for his family. He was the eldest child, and his family was still living in poverty, and so Edouard decided every single time that he would continue to return to the circus. From this point on, Edouard struggled with a cough that would keep him up at night and was getting progressively worse. After each performance, he would go home exhausted and struggling to breathe. But no one who was watching him perform noticed this. During this same stay in Montreal, Edouard was staying in a hotel that was also used as a gymnasium, property of the famous Eugene Tremblay, who was a world lightweight wrestling champion. Eugene Tremblay was partners with Maurice J, who was at the time considered an equal of Louis Cyr, who was the strongest man in Canada. The gym was often used as a practice space for wrestling, and many people from across Montreal would come to try to test their strength against Blais. And so many of the guests would come and enjoyed watching Blais and Beaupré battle with each other. Now, it was at this time that Edouard was commissioned to battle with Louis Cyr. And so on Monday, March 15th, 1901, at Summer Park, Louis Cyr and Edouard Beaupré competed in a wrestling match. The next day, the newspaper La Presse gave this following statement. Last night's wrestling match at Summer Park between Beaupré and Cyr, one of the tallest, the other the broadest, was as short as possible. Cyr won with amazing ease, as Géant Beaupré hardly dared to lift a hand against him. We expected Cyr to win, but not so easily. Cyr threw his opponent 4 times, but twice outside the ring, which the umpire did not count valid. Cyr easily discovered the weak spot of his opponent. The match was grotesque and greatly amused the crowd of 1,000 spectators. If Beaupré had not been so timid, the match would have lasted longer. It lasted only a few minutes. Now, it's speculated that Beaupré lost the match because he was weakened from his tuberculosis, but there's also a discrepancy between the age and measurements of the two men, so I'll insert that here so you can judge for yourself. A few weeks after this battle with Louis Cyr, Edouard tried again to be a rancher, this time in Montana. But it was also at this time that supposedly an American discovered Edouard again and convinced him to continue his life in the circus. And so from 1901 to 1904, realizing that he would never be a rancher because of his height and his weight, he decided to join with the Barnum and Bailey Circus officially. 21, he was 7 feet 11 inches and weighed 365 pounds. His neck measured 21 inches, and his hands were 12.5 inches from fingertip to the end of his wrist. His chest measured 56 inches, and his shoes were about a size 22. It was also rumored that he and, at the time, the world's tallest woman, Ella Ewing, were engaged to be married, although this was a publicity stunt and neither of the two actually liked each other. But newspapers did report it every once in a while. Every couple of months, it was reported that the two giants were going to be married. Ella Ewing was 7 feet and 4 inches. 7 feet and 4 inches. Also, while traveling, Edouard enjoyed showing up to local circuses to see their resident giants, and without fail, he would always be much taller than each of them. It would ruin their show in the process when people would stop to gawk at him instead. On one of these little excursions, the Ringling brothers saw that he was much taller than their own resident giant, and so they hired Edouard on the spot. In 1904 occurred the St. Louis World's Fair. At this point, Edouard was 23 years old and was 8 feet and 2.5 inches tall. He was 370 pounds. His hat was a size 15, and his collar was a size 27. He was performing at the fair as the main performer of the Fairyland on the Point exhibit, where he continued to perform feats of strength. After each performance, he would return to bed exhausted and was increasingly unable to sleep through the night thanks to a persistent cough from his tuberculosis. At 1:15 a.m. on Sunday morning of July the 3rd, 1904, at the age of 23 and nearly 2,000 kilometers away from home, Edouard Beaupré succumbed to his illness and died on the grounds of the St. Louis World Fair. J. H. Noel, who accompanied Edouard that night, gives the following report of his last moments.
Around 11:15 p.m., his show was over. At midnight, Edouard, feeling tired, drank a cup of tea. Almost immediately, he began to cough and spit blood. I called the blood to his attention. Beaupré added that he felt a strong burning in his lungs. He tried to get undressed for bed but could not. I then advised him to call the doctor. Beaupré consented and added painfully, "I'm dying. It's sad to die so young and so far from dear parents." He then asked for a glass of water. I ran to get it, and when I returned, I found him unconscious. The ambulance arrived. They drove him to the emergency hospital where he died a few minutes later.
Weight, 360 pounds. Height, 8 feet, 3 inches. Black hair and brown eyes. Exterior appearance. Body of giant with powerful bones. Muscles somewhat emaciated. Swelling of the outside of the upper right jaw. Lungs. At the top of the upper left lobe, there are 2 openings. One of these shows an empty ulceration, which explains the fatal hemorrhage. Tuberculosis in the parenchyma. Cause of death, hematopsis following fiber-ulcerated tuberculosis. To put it plainly, Edouard died of bleeding in the lungs caused by tuberculosis. On July 14, 1904, Edouard's mother gave birth to her final child. She was named Florestine Edwardina, in memory of the brother she would never meet. So now this is where the story gets a bit convoluted and there are a few different versions. So I'm going to go over those, but first I'm going to go through the most basic accepted story, and then I'll go through a little bit of the discrepancies and who is involved or not involved. Immediately after Edouard died, the Beaupré family was notified, and Gaspard decided that he would come to pick up the body himself. So he begins his travels, and when he gets to Winnipeg, he calls the people in St. Louis, to the embalmers, and he tells them that he is coming to pick up the body and to be ready for him. But the people on the other end, they say that he would actually have to pay double the freight price to get the body back home, plus his own fare. Now, so that's triple fare. Gaspard was living in relative poverty, so he was not able to afford this. However, Edouard did have savings, so logically he would have been able to have these savings, but somehow they disappeared. So Gaspard decided that he didn't have this money, so he agreed to allow Edouard to be buried in St. Louis. So Gaspard returns home empty-handed, believing that his son is going to be buried in St. Louis. So the entire Beaupré family believes that their loved one has been buried in St. Louis. However, the person that was on the other end telling Gaspard that he would have to pay triple the freight, it was William Burke, the manager of the circus with which Edouard was employed. And after this phone call, William Burke skipped town with the circus and took with him all of Edouard's savings. And in doing so, he also neglected to pay the embalmers, Eberly and Keyes, which meant that Eberly and Keyes, who was furious at not being paid, decided that they would earn back this money from the embalming by displaying Edouard's body. So the people of St. Louis were able to pay a price, and they could gawk at the body of a giant. At some point, Edouard's body was either sold to a traveling showman, or it was taken by Pascal Bonneau Jr., who was the son of Pascal Bonneau, the man who employed Edouard on his ranch. No matter who took him, though, he eventually ended up in Montreal, where he was then donated to the Musée Eden, the Eden Museum in Montreal. Now, this museum is a museum of oddities, so it had a whole bunch of wax figures and oddities in nature, like fetal pigs and deformed fetuses and stuff like that. So account number 2. Account number 2 states that after Edouard had been embalmed, his body was given to Aimé Bernard, his manager. Now, Aimé Bernard had asked the circus to pay for this embalming, but the circus refused, and so Aimé paid out of his own wallet. And so since he had paid from his own money, Aimé Bernard is the one who decided that he needed to make back this money and was the one that put Edouard's body on display around St. Louis. Either way, he was used as a promotional prop, kind of like a mannequin in store windows, and a lot of people did show up to see this body in the store windows. Now next, the body was sold to a traveling showman who then took it to Montreal and sold it to the Eden Museum. In this account, there's no mention of Pascal Bonneau Jr. After the body was brought to the Eden Museum in Montreal, rumors spiraled that there was a real corpse giant amid the wax figures of this oddity museum, and so hundreds of spectators arrived each day to see it. This small, understaffed museum was quickly overwhelmed by the attention that this exhibit drew, and the crowding and shoving became so great that Montreal authorities actually had to tell them to cut the exhibit time short. So the body was then moved to a more, quote, discreet location. After some time, the cadaver was then sold to a traveling circus, which in turn went bankrupt, and they either forgot or abandoned the body. In the spring of 1907, a group of children playing in Bellerive Park curiously opened an abandoned shed door. Here, they made the grim discovery of a giant, decaying corpse lying inside. The children alerted their parents, who then called the police. First, a physician from Maisonneuve was called, and he in turn called another physician by the name of Dr. Louis Napoleon Delorme. Dr. Delorme was an anatomy professor at the University of Montreal, and he paid the city $25 to take this unclaimed corpse for research purposes at the anatomy department. There, Edouard's body was specially mummified so that it would not decay as quickly. It was then to be displayed for academic use by medical students. Here, Edouard remained safely in a sealed glass case for many years to come, frozen in time by this mummification process. The cause of Edouard's growth was only discovered post-mortem when his body had been bought by the University of Montreal, so this was quite a bit after he had passed away in 1904. At the time that he had died, very, very little was known about the brain, about the pituitary gland, and about growth hormones in general. X-ray technology had only been in clinical use since 1895. But we now know that giantism or gigantism is normally caused by an adenoma or a tumor on the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland creates somatotropic cells, which in turn secrete growth hormones. So this is the signal that tells the body how many growth hormones are needed in order to grow at a normal rate. With the adenoma on the pituitary gland, the brain doesn't have a signal to stop, and so it just keeps on pushing out these growth hormones, and there's no signal to stop, so you just keep growing. This is a real scan of Edouard's sella turcica, the bone casing which surrounds the pituitary gland, and which can be found in Dr. Maurice's article. This is often a hereditary condition, but in Edouard's case, Dr. Maurice Blais conducted a thorough investigation of his lineage, and no other case of giantism was ever discovered. Now, this quote is directly from J. Maurice's article. I'll read it here. At age 17, he lifted an 800-pound horse. In 1901, he was 7 feet 9 inches tall and fractured a leg in Montreal while lifting a 900-pound weight. However, there is no evidence in his remains nor by X-ray of such a fracture. It appears that the sprain made him more prudent, as he never dared to lift a weight over 900 pounds. I was at the museum that is dedicated to him in Willow Bunch. There is a little display that talks about how he did fracture his legs. So it's interesting to see that in the actual report, he never actually did have evidence of a leg fracture, but he probably did sprain himself or at least strained himself and never again lifted that type of weight. The true fight for repatriation began in 1967 when Dr. Maurice Blais wrote an article on giantism mentioning Edouard and his autopsy in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Now, this article focused on the pituitary gland, and so it was read by a Saskatchewanian medical student who happened to be the son of a woman who was on the city board. This woman worked with Ovila L'Esperance, who happened to be the nephew of Edouard Beaupré. While on a trip home to Saskatchewan, this student told his mother about what he had read in this article. And so the mother mentioned it to Ovila while they were preparing for the 100th anniversary of the town of Willow Bunch. So Ovila didn't realize that his uncle was still on display, and so he decided that in recognition of the 100th anniversary of the town, he would try to repatriate the body of his uncle. In 1967, Ovila traveled to Montreal to try to retrieve the body for the first time. However, they declined to give it to him. They did offer a compromise, however. They would remove him from public display, but he would still be available to medical students. According to Ovila, the university claimed to be afraid that the body would be dug up from its grave and placed on display again. There was also pressure from other museums who wanted to buy the body for themselves. Unable to do anything, Ovila simply asked that a cloth be placed around Edouard's waist. Ovila would spend the next couple of years corresponding with the University of Montreal with the help of his sister who lived in Quebec near Montreal. They were told that it would need to be proven that they were the next of kin to Edouard Beaupré in order to legally claim this body. And so it was discovered that Edouard's legal next of kin was his living sister, Sister Germaine, who was still living in Saskatchewan. As Sister Germaine was a nun, she declined to have any involvement in this legal process, and so she agreed to give her title as next of kin to Ovila L'Esperance. Once this legal title was transferred over to Avila, the real negotiations between the University of Montreal and himself could begin. It was said that the university was afraid that if the body was transferred anywhere else whole, that someone would dig it up out of its grave and it would just be displayed again. And so they were worried that if they gave the body, there would be some sort of freak show in Willow Bunch or somewhere else. You know, maybe like the family would sell it or display it again for profit. And so, as you can see in the Entente, it was decided that in order to release the body, it would need to be agreed to be cremated and then released into the custody of Avila's sister, who then brought it back to Saskatchewan. Here are the terms of the Entente. 1. The university will see to the cremation of Edouard's remains, which will then be placed into the custody of Josephine, Ovila's sister. Josephine, in agreement with Ovila, will then see to the burial or the entombment of the ashes. Now, here crossed out and initialed by Josephine is that the ashes were originally to be placed in the Willow Bunch Cemetery, which is located just outside of Willow Bunch. We're going to go back to that point as well. 3. The university will donate $1,000 to the erection of a monument in memory of Edouard Beaupré. The inscription under said monument will acknowledge the University of Montreal and its contributions. The signers agreed that this entente answers to their desires regarding Edouard, and that the university will have no further obligation except as previously mentioned. The ashes were kept in Montreal until July the 1st, 1990, and were then returned to Willow Bunch in the hands of Ovila. On July the 7th, 1990, now 86 years after his death, Edouard received a memorial and a burial in his hometown of Willow Bunch, surrounded by hundreds of community members and descendants. The ashes were buried at the foot of the statue erected in memorial of Edouard Beaupré, which still stands on the front lawn of the Willow Bunch Museum. His hand is raised as if waving to beckon in visitors to the former convent, now a museum. I had been asked if the giant was meant to be giving a high five. Children climbed the statue to take photos. I myself did the same thing as a child, reaching up as far as I could and raising my arm in the same way for photos. Inside, the gift shop is overflowing with merchandise bearing his name and face, the giant of Willow Bunch. As you continue out of the gift shop into the first room, dubbed the Giant's Room, you're immediately taken aback by the 8-foot, 3-inch papier-mâché likeness of Edouard that's nearly touching the ceiling. It's in this room that you can compare your height with the statue and the length of your hand to a photo on the wall. You can measure your foot against his. Here, you can see the 9-foot-long cast-iron bed that he slept in that was taken apart and then reassembled after his death. You can see the trunk that supported his feet when he had outgrown his bed, his coat, his rings, and his size 23 shoes. As you travel deeper into the rolling hills of southern Saskatchewan, the tops of the hills begin to level off at their peaks. You may see hawks flying low, and you'll pass by a lake that salt rises up from, and which once overflowed onto the road. And then, nestled in the valley, the tiny village will come into view. A sign will greet you, and everything will feel still and quiet. It's like any other small town, but for its main attraction. This is his final resting place. After a life of not fitting in, of being a sideshow attraction, and after an afterlife of being passed between institutions of entertainment and education, this, now, is where he lays, under a statue that, in the opinion of many who visit him, does not portray his handsome and unique face at all. He lays here, while people stand on the white rocks to get a better photo, not of his headstone, but of the likeness of him that beckons people into the gift shop. He does not lay peacefully in the Willow Bunch Cemetery, as my grandparents and my relatives do. He is not afforded that option. He is home in the sense that, yes, he is in Willow Bunch with his descendants. However, one cannot help but think back to the concerns of the University of Montreal, who feared another freak show. He's no longer under that glass case to be studied, though the study of his body has brought some of the greatest understanding of giantism, and which has aided in the treatment of those with his same condition. You can see the report that I completed on display at the Willow Bunch Museum, detailing both his life and taking a deeper dive into his physiology. I was able to complete this with the help of my cousin, Johanna, and with the support of those at the Willow Bunch Museum. As quoted from Robert Bogdan, research is often more than an intellectual journey. It can be an emotional odyssey in which you confront who you are and what you carry with you as a member of your culture. It's true that it's uncomfortable to think about these stories of people being exploited in life and in death for something that they're powerless to change. Looking at cases such as Edouard's challenges us to understand past practices and socioeconomic factors that led people to choose the life of the sideshow freak. It challenges us to change our perception of human abnormality and what it meant to be self-sufficient in a world that sought to keep disabled people out of the workforce. But it also means forcing ourselves to face the uncomfortable reality of exploitation and the effect of poverty on people's choices. He may have chosen to remain in the circus, but Edouard did not deserve the treatment he faced in his life or after it. Merci encore à mes cousins, Johanna et Nick, à mon ami Kobe de m'avoir prêté ta voix, à ma sœur Caitlin pour ton image, et surtout à ma grand-mère, qui a transmis des histoires de Géant du Willow Bunch, qui était fière de son héritage fransaskois, et qui m'a transmis son amour de l'histoire et du patrimoine familial. Merci et soyez gentils les uns envers les autres.